All right, this is Ellen Jacart, and I'm going to start our workshop. This is the Take Control workshop, which is going to talk about identifying and controlling invasive plants and planting native plants. I want to thank you all for being with us today and rolling with the changes due to the COVID-19 virus situation and wanting to be safe and healthy and do this online rather than in person, though certainly it would have been wonderful to meet all of you in person and actually be able to work on controlling invasive plants together after talking about it. This is the best option that we have available to us, and I appreciate your joining us. I am the chair of a local group that's called the Monroe County Identify and Reduce Invasive Species Group. That is for short MC-IRIS, and mc-iris.org is our website showing on your screen right there. I will be sending out after this show all of the slides. And so it's finished. I want to introduce Mary Wells, who's also on the phone on the show, and she is going to be unmuted the whole time. So she can break in and relay to me any questions that you guys have. That way I can't watch the chat box and watch the slides at the same time. If you've got a question, don't hesitate to put it down in that chat box. We also would like if you'd open up the participant box and put your full name. If you have just a nickname on the participant list, if you could put your full name so we can match it up and know who was in the workshop today for our records, we'd appreciate that. All right, the agenda for today is pretty simple. We're going to talk about how to identify the most common invasive plants in Monroe County. And once you learn how to identify them, we're going to talk about how do you control these same species. And at the end of the talk, I'm going to segue into the importance of native plants and what the connection is between native plants and deer and invasive plants.
Ellen, we're having a little breakup here.
Okay, I will go over the agenda again. I apologize, folks, for audio quality issues. This is the best connection we've got, and there may be times that the voice sounds distorted, and Mary will let me know when that's the case so I can repeat things that you may miss. The agenda is up there in front of you on the slide. Rather than take a break and go out for a control demonstration and workshop, of course, we will just talk about invasive control and discuss different settings and priorities and so on. All right, a couple of definitions. Plants have habits or growth forms, and we like to break how we talk about control into growth forms because there are different control methods available for herbaceous plants, those without woody tissue, and woody plants, those that have woody tissue. And in the herbaceous group, that divides into grasses, forbs, which are wildflowers essentially, and some vines, which are herbaceous, like say bindweed, that's an herbaceous vine. The woody species, there are also woody vines like Asian bittersweet, and then shrubs and trees. And so we'll be using those terms as we go along. And you'll see in the bottom left of each slide, here it says grass. I'll tell you the growth form for each of the species we're talking about as we go. So we're going to go in order, starting with the grasses. And the first species is Japanese stilt grass. This is an annual grass, which grows, it can be a half foot tall, 6 inches, up to 4 feet or even more. I've seen it up to 6 feet tall when it has plenty of moisture and sunlight. It grows in a branching, sprawling manner. And you can see that, compare this picture in the middle. This is coming from one seed, and it has many branches to the plant. This is, say, in June, when the plant is maybe a foot tall. As the summer goes on, each of these branches falls down. And when it falls, if you look at the right-hand picture, you will get roots coming out from the nodes, and then it'll shoot up another plant. So that one plant coming from one seed can cover 10 to 20 square feet simply by sprawling and continuing to grow outwards. The stems look like a delicate bamboo. The leaves are alternate in how they attach to the stems. They have narrow lens-shaped leaves up to about 3 inches long, which is not very long for a grass. Most grass species have longer leaves than that. Importantly, there is in the middle of this leaf a silvery stripe. If you flex that leaf in the sunlight, that shininess will show. Stiltgrass puts out a spike of flowers that is very simple. Often it is just this simple couple-inch long flowering stalk. The flowers then turn into tiny, tiny seeds that, when the plant is ripe, break off and scatter. It can have a side branch or 2 side branches, but it's a very small flowering head. The reason Japanese stiltgrass is a problem is that it grows abundantly and spreads very quickly. In this upper picture, all of these little, what look like green V's, upside down V's to me, that is all stiltgrass. And as you can see, it grows quite densely, and it is able to exclude a lot of other species. The bottom picture shows later in the summer where the plants are now a couple feet tall, and you can see how dense it is, that it's essentially a lawn of Japanese stiltgrass that has completely displaced the native species in the understory of that forest. The map is here to show you the progression of this species in the state, because this is one of our more recent species. It came in about 35 years ago, right here at Harrison Crawford State Forest on horse trails, probably brought in by horse hooves. And each year since then, it has moved a little bit further north, and now there are populations. There's actually one in Lake County that isn't shown here. It moves by way of hikers' boots, bike tires, horse hooves. It's often moved as a result of human recreation. So we often see it for the first time in a county at a state park or a city park, where the seeds drop off someone's and start a population.
Ellen, can you repeat that last sentence?
We often see Japanese stiltgrass pop up in recreation sites because it's being moved by hikers' boots. The seeds fall off your boots and then start in populations, which is an important reason why you should always clean your boots before going into a state park or any place where you're going to be trail walking, to make sure that you don't inadvertently bring in some seeds from invasive plants. One more picture on stiltgrass is what it looks like in the fall and early winter. This mass of green, of orange stems on this downed log, that's all stiltgrass. And that's what it looks like as soon as frost hits in the middle of October. The green plants turn orange and just fall to the ground. And where there's a lot of stiltgrass, it'll look like somebody scattered a whole bunch of orange hay. And you can see that along many trail systems. Unfortunately, in southern Indiana, is you see that mass of stiltgrass lining the trails every winter. Okay, now if you look in the lower left, you'll see we're moving on to the forbs. These are what you might call wildflowers. Garlic mustard is a biennial invasive plant, meaning that it has a 2-year life cycle, with the first year being the seed develops into a rosette. The second year, that rosette then puts up a stalk of flowers. The flowers are 4-petaled and white. And then those flowers, once they are pollinated, develop into the fruits, which are these long, skinny pods. And each pod will have many, many seeds. And as the plant dies and dries out, because this is a biennial, its life cycle is finished once it's produced its seeds. As the plant dries out, those pods open up and the seeds hit the ground and get, like the stilt grass, this also gets carried around a lot by hiking boots because the seeds are very small. And then once those seeds hit the ground, they germinate and create a first-year rosette, and the cycle begins again. The problem with garlic mustard is, first off, it displaces native wildflowers, like Japanese stiltgrass does. In this picture, this is a picture of what should be a beautiful scene of spring wildflowers. It was taken in the middle of April, when we should have all of those flowers open, from celandine poppy to blue phlox to jack in the pulpit, spring beauty.
Ellen, can you repeat after spring beauty?
Yes. Because we have spring ephemerals, spring wildflowers that are relatively short compared to garlic mustard, the garlic mustard overtops them and shades them out, suppressing the native wildflowers, which you can't even see in this picture because the garlic mustard is suppressing them. But the other thing that garlic mustard does is it exudes a chemical into the soil, and that chemical kills mycorrhizal fungi. And mycorrhizal fungi are beneficial fungi that grow on the roots of our native trees and helps that tree take up more water, more nutrients. When garlic mustard comes in and lets loose this chemical that kills the mycorrhizae, it puts the trees at a big disadvantage, that they can no longer take up as much water or nutrients. And so we see the growth rate of trees greatly decrease, and the establishment of young trees is greatly decreased. And a last reason that garlic mustard is a problem is that deer rarely eat it, which gives it a strong advantage over the natives. And this is something more about at the end of the show when we talk about the interaction of invasive species, deer, and native plants. Japanese knotweed is also a forb, but it's a big one. Garlic mustard was just 3 to 4 feet tall. This is up to 10 feet tall. This picture on the left is what it looks like right about now. The first stems are emerging from the ground, and they start by coming up red, almost looking like red asparagus shoots. And then as the stem continues to come out, the leaves unfurl and the stem elongates until it reaches up to 10 feet tall. The leaves shown here are alternate on the stem. They're egg-shaped to almost triangular, and the leaves are quite big. They're 4 to 6 inches long and 3 to 4 inches wide. So this is a plant that you are going to notice if it's growing in your area, because it's over your head, it's got these big leaves, and it has these white frothy flowers in mid to late summer. And what it does is, first, causes a huge loss of wildlife.
Ellen, can you repeat the loss
That
of
is next. Wildlife habitat.
Yes.
You got it.
Thanks.
This is a loss of wildlife habitat, because if you look at that picture in the bottom left, there is nothing else growing here except for Japanese knotweed. And that means that all of the food that wildlife would normally rely on has been completely eliminated by the knotweed. A more dramatic thing that Japanese knotweed does is this upper right picture. And remember I said that when they first come out of the ground, they're a reddish color, and then gradually they turn green. Well, these are the young shoots popping up, but they're coming through asphalt. And as you can see here and in the background, Japanese knotweed has the ability to go through asphalt, has the ability to go through the mortar between bricks and end up in your living room. It is considered one of the 10 worst weeds in the world because of the damage that it can do to infrastructure. It's something that you never. bottom picture
We missed
shows what it does.
your, what you said after
along,
infrastructure, Ellen. Sorry.
okay, no problem. After the top picture is on the infrastructure, if you look at the bottom picture, when Japanese knotweed grows on stream banks, because it gets rid of all the other plants, it means that there's very little left to hold the soil. And so when the water goes up because of rains, the banks shear off and slump into the creek, adding a lot of sediment to the water and also spreading the Japanese knotweed downstream. So this is a common sight you see once Japanese knotweed takes over creeks. Winter creeper is one that most of us in the Bloomington area are very, very familiar with, because winter creeper was very commonly planted as a yard vine back in the 1950s when subdivisions were being built. It's an evergreen vine and it's clinging. It can climb up trees. The leaves are opposite each other on the stem. The stems are generally green. There are silvery veins, so especially the midrib of the leaf is very evident, much lighter color. And the leaves have teeth all the way around. When it grows on the ground like this, it can form a very dense ground cover that displaces all of the native wildflowers. But the real trouble starts when it starts growing up the trees. When it grows up trees, it can change its physiology so it's able to produce flowers and then fruits. And once a plant produces fruits, then the birds can come eat the fruits and transport this invasive for many miles away to start new populations elsewhere. When it grows up the tree, it also can make that tree much more vulnerable to wind throw. Winter creeper can have vines that get 6 inches in diameter. And when you think about the weight that that puts on the canopy of a tree, it makes it much more susceptible if a wind comes up for the whole tree to just fall over. Japanese honeysuckle is another vine. This vine is semi-evergreen. It keeps some of its leaves, but some of its leaves also fall off in the winter, about half and half where we are at this latitude. It's perennial, it's woody. The leaves are simple and opposite, and they have no teeth. It's a smooth edge on the leaf. Sometimes they're lobed, but that's somewhat unusual. Usually they are just entire like this. Smell really good, and that's the main reason the Japanese honeysuckle was introduced to the United States, because of the fragrance. So people would plant it on their trellises near the house and be able to smell that fragrance whenever it was in bloom. The flowers start out white and turn to this cream color here as they age. The reason Japanese honeysuckle is a problem is because it's very competitive with native plants in 2 ways. First, the bottom picture shows you at the front of the picture, this is ground surface where I'm standing with my camera. But this mat of Japanese honeysuckle continues to climb and grow over all of the vegetation underneath. And at the back of the picture here, it's about 20 feet in the air. And this is a tree sapling that the vines are literally pulling down. So it's able to
We lost that part.
But they, okay, the Japanese honeysuckle can smother anything below it. So that's the first way it competes. The second way is it has a very competitive root system underground, and it's able to better take up water and nutrients than the native plants in the area. The next vine is Asian bittersweet, and this one is deciduous. That is, all of its leaves fall off every year. The leaves are alternate on the stem, And the berries occur
That-
up and down each stem.
And
so
we missed the word berries, but I think we're getting it.
okay. The berries will grow up and down the stems because in the axil of every leaf, there will be a little spray of flowers that then turns into berries. And that means it has fruits all along the stem. And that's why it was so popular to make wreaths of this, because you could take any stem, form it into a circle, and it had berries all along it. If you have native bittersweet, which can be confused with the Asian bittersweet, the American bittersweet has fruits only at the end of each twig. So the twig would be bare except for the very end where there would be a terminal clump of berries. The American bittersweet also has, if you look at its leaves, narrower and longer leaves versus Asian bittersweet, which has these roundish leaves. A literal green curtain
That
where
whole
there's enough
sentence
sunlight.
dropped out
Okay.
before green curtain.
It forms these dense stands, Asian bittersweet does. And that means that it's able to outcompete plants that are here on the forest edge. The vines also go up to the top of the canopy. And again, just like we talked about with winter creeper, adds so much weight to the top of the canopy that it makes the tree vulnerable to wind throw. And the other thing that Asian bittersweet does that has us worried is that it hybridizes with native bittersweet. So if both of these species are growing in the same area, they'll hybridize, and it means that the American bittersweet is not going to actually be able to reproduce and give progeny that are true American bittersweet. Okay, now we're on to shrubs. Perhaps the worst invasive shrub we've got is actually a group of shrubs, the Asian bush honeysuckles. We call them the honeysuckles because there's actually 4 different ones that cause problems. Amur honeysuckle is the main one that we have in the Monroe County area. This is Amur honeysuckle right here. But in the state, there's also Marrow's, Tatarian, and Bell's, which is a hybrid between Marrow's and Tatarian. All of these look relatively similar and they act relatively similar. They're all invasive, so we often refer to them as a group, the Asian bush honeysuckles. They are dense multi-stemmed shrubs, 6 to 12 feet tall. They have opposite leaves, oval, oblong. These are entire, that is, they don't have any teeth on the edge. They have flowers that are and then these flowers turn into fruits that can be red. In our area, they are usually red, but they can also be orange or yellow. This picture in the lower right shows you what it looks like in the middle of April, just a few short weeks away. When you look out in the forest and you see this, everything green you're seeing there is Asian bush honeysuckle shrubs, because in the middle of April, our trees and our shrubs are not leafed out. So Asian bush honeysuckle leaves out much earlier than our natives, giving them a competitive advantage by starting the season earlier. But it also means that it's much easier to see them and kill them in the middle of April, as well as the middle of October on, when all of our native shrubs have lost their leaves. Asian bush honeysuckle will still be green, making it easy to find and control. And what's the problem that Asian bush honeysuckle causes? Because it grows so densely, this lower picture shows pure Asian bush honeysuckle, big plants in the understory of a forest. Not growing. In addition to the shade, Asian bush honeysuckle also produces a chemical like garlic mustard does that can decrease the growth of other plants. So as a consequence, what we see is a reduction of understory plant richness, or the number of species, a decrease in the native plant cover, or how much ground is actually covered by native plants. And the same is true for tree seedlings, fewer species and less density. It also will cause a decrease, significant decrease of tree growth rates. And I mean for the canopy trees, these huge trees that are towering way over these shrubs, it appears that Asian bush honeysuckle can more effectively take up water and nutrient than native plants. And so by stealing the water and nutrients from the canopy trees, it will decrease their growth by over 50%. And finally, Asian bush honeysuckle can increase tick-related illnesses in communities. The way it does this is because of this density, the structure, the hosts for ticks have better habitat. You have more deer, you have more small mammals, and that means you have more ticks. And where you have more ticks, it has been shown, you have more tick-related illnesses. This has been shown a couple of times for not only Asian bush honeysuckle, but for Japanese barberry, by simply counting ticks in an infested area, checking with county health departments to see how many tick-related illnesses have been reported, then go out, control the invasive, the next year, count the ticks again, call the county health department again. And in 2 studies that I've read, in both cases, there was significant reduction in ticks and tick-related illnesses by removing the invasive shrub. Another invasive shrub is privet. This one is not as widely distributed. It tends to be mostly along forested creeks and in wetlands. It likes moisture habitat. But where it grows, it can be up to 8 feet tall. This is a privet plant right here. The leaves are opposite on the stem. You can see in the middle picture. They're almost stalkless. That is, they don't have a petiole. It looks like the leaf is attached almost directly to the stem. The flowers are white and they are held in little clusters at the end of the branches. So all of these white clusters are the flowers. And those turn into these black berries by the end of summer, which are then eaten by birds. And the birds distribute them to, this is a wetland that had hundreds and hundreds of privet shrubs in it, as birds the berries from nearby landscaping. Autumn olive is a really well-known invasive because for many, many years it was sold and promoted by wildlife agencies because it had red berries and people assumed that that meant it was good for birds. It got widely planted in Indiana and elsewhere in the Northeast US. To identify it, it's one of the easiest to identify. The leaves are simple, they're alternate on the stem, and importantly, they are silver gray on the underside of the leaf. The upper side of the leaf is plain old green, but that underside, silvery. It's very distinctive. And it shows up even in this picture below. You can see there's sort of a silvery flash to many of the leaves. That's because the backside of the leaf is showing. The flowers are cream-colored, tube-shaped, found in leaf axils, and they'll be in bloom in a few weeks. Those flowers then turn and again, in a similar story, the birds eat those berries and spread the seeds elsewhere. They form dense stands in open fields, like what you're seeing here, one big autumn olive. Because the birds spread the berries, you will often see pastures just fill up with autumn olive until it's so dense that you can't walk through it. But you will also find autumn olive in the understory of forests, where it's not particularly happy because this is not a shade-loving species. It prefers growing in the sunlight, but it will establish in the understory of the forest and it will patiently wait for a tree to fall. And as soon as there is more light, autumn olive then moves quickly to fill that light gap. Multiflora rose. One of the most...
Ellen, we have a question from Nicole.
Yes.
Does autumn olive have little spots under the leaves when it buds out? And is it budding out now?
Good question, Nicole. Yes, it does indeed. When the leaves are first coming out, and they are coming out right now in our area, they're about an inch. They've kind of, the ones I've seen recently are about an inch long, and they do look like they have spots all over them. Those are the silvery hairs, little hairs on the leaves. As the leaf expands, those spots disappear and it ends up just completely silvery hairs throughout. But they do look spotted now as the leaves are emerging.
We have, oh, she just says, thank you. She has a lot of work to do this weekend.
Okay. And I see as I'm looking at the chat box, one question to me privately, someone who is late, but asking if this is being recorded and can we get a copy of the slides? Yes, let me mention that. After this is over, I'll send you a copy of the slides, so you'll have all of these. And then tomorrow, I will send you a copy of the recording. This is being recorded. It just takes a little editing to have it ready, and then I'll send out that link as well, so you've got it. And we will probably, I've done 4 of these in the last few weeks, we'll choose the best one and put that link on the mc-iris.org website. So that you can access it anytime or refer people to it. Back to Multiflora rose. This is a very painful invasive, very painful. It's a thorny shrub with arching or climbing canes and stiff curved thorns that can rip through denim, can rip through your skin. This is another one that was highly promoted by wildlife agencies because it produced fruits that they thought would be good for birds. And then it took off, and like autumn olive, became a real nuisance species by birds spreading the berries and starting populations where we didn't want a thorny shrub. The leaves are alternate. The leaves are shown here. They look pretty much like any rose leaves superficially. And so one of the first questions we usually get is, well, how do I know when I see a rose leaf whether it is Multiflora rose or one of our native roses? Good question. Multiflora rose has a fringed stipule. Shows here, but I did a blow up here at the top. That is on the petiole of a leaf, and the petiole is this stem part here, where it attaches to the main stem of the plant. All roses have stipules, but they all look different. Most of our native roses, it's just a plain green, like a pair of green ears, one on each side of the petiole, no fringes. So if you have a leaf and you see these fringy stipules at the bottom, you have Multiflora rose, the invasive one. The other way, if you have flowers and fruits, the other way that you can know this is Multiflora rose is simply the name. Multiflora is many flowered. And you can see there are many flowers here. There's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 flowers in that cluster. And fruits, similarly, there's a good dozen or more fruits. Our native roses don't do that. Our native roses, first, are by and large pink. And in a cluster, they would never have this many. So if you have the flowers and fruits to look at, you would know immediately that has to be Multiflora rose. And the problem with Multiflora rose is that it forms dense thickets in prairies and woodlands. And because of its spiny nature, it can very quickly make an area completely inaccessible to wildlife or people because it just forms this impenetrable hedge. Okay, now we just have 2 trees, and we'll have gone through the basic invasive species I wanted to cover with you. Tree of Heaven is a tree that has pinnately compound leaves. This is a great picture showing this is one leaf with many, many leaflets opposite each other. So this is one leaf. That leaflet margin is mostly smooth. There's no teeth on it except right coarse teeth right there on each leaflet, but otherwise the edge is smooth. One way to tell this from native trees like black walnut or sumac, which also have pinnately compound leaves, is that sumac and black walnut both have teeth all the way around each leaflet, sharp little teeth, which tree heaven doesn't have. But another way that people use to identify it, if you've got a leaf, is to crush the leaf and smell it. And there is an unusual peanut butter smell that these leaves have. People describe it differently. Many people describe it as rancid peanut butter. And once you've smelled that, you won't forget it. And so it's a useful way to identify tree of heaven. It is known for growing fast. That's perhaps the biggest problem with it, is that it grows per year, which is more than twice as fast as our native hardwood trees grow. So in a race, and survival of the fittest, nature is a race, the native trees lose to tree of heaven because it grows faster, gets taller, and then simply shades out native trees. It is a prolific cedar starting at 3 years old. It puts out clusters of fruits that look like this. The seed is in the center of this wind-blown fruit that then allows the tree to extend further because it blows the fruits elsewhere. But tree of heaven is also really well known for sprouting, that the tree can send out sprouts with rhizomes that go many, many feet away from the original tree, send up sprouts, and so that it can form really large monocultures of nothing but tree of heaven displacing native trees. And the final species, Callery pear, also known as Bradford pear. Bradford pear was the first cultivar of this ornamental flowering pear that was sold in the United States. It's an ornamental tree that is literally planted everywhere, and they're already coming into bloom to the south of us. By next week, they'll be in bloom here. You'll see them in every strip mall and every subdivision. Very popular because it's a small tree, just 20 to 30 feet tall, which often fits the space available in an urban setting better than a huge native tree. And they flower by early to mid-April. The flowers open up before the leaves come out. So all you see are the white flowers. The flowers smell like rotting fish. So it's not a very attractive tree when you're standing right next to it when it's in bloom. Those flowers then turn into round brown fruits, shown in this picture in the lower right. Those fruits are less than an inch in diameter. They're small. This is, of course, not the edible pear species. That's a whole different species. These little brown fruits are not edible to humans. They are edible to starlings. Starlings love these. And I've seen strip malls that have Callery pear where the starling flocks in the fall will just swoop down and cover the trees and take every one of the fruits off to eat. And then, of course, they fly away over to the forest you see in the middle picture, and they excrete the seeds from those fruits. And this is a very sad forester standing in front of a forest that he manages, and everything green that you see in the picture is Callery pear spread by those birds. And because of the density of the Callery pear in this forester is spending over $100,000 a year just to try to beat back the Callery pear and let the native hardwoods be able to regenerate and continue this forest. So it's a real threat to our forests, to forest understories, to rights of ways, to fields. The leaves, to identify it, They have this ovoid shape. They're pointy at the top, then they get very broad at the bottom. They are usually very shiny. There are tiny teeth that go all around the leaf, so tiny you have to look closely to see them. And importantly, one of the things that stands out to me when I'm trying to identify it is the leaf edge is wavy. It undulates up and down. And I think you can see that on many of these leaves, that they're not flat, they undulate. Another way, in the fall, it's very easy to see how far calorie pear has invaded in the Bloomington area, because this is the field behind Lowe's, and all of the little burgundy trees are calorie pears. Most of the calorie pears turn burgundy in the fall, so they really show up then, and it's easy to see where they have invaded.
Ellen, we have a question from Nicole.
Yes.
Just inquiring, I know there are some states and communities that offer native tree replacement if you cut down the Bradford pear in your yard. Any plans in the works for Monroe County? My street is full of them.
That is a good question. Thanks, Nicole. The wonderful group who's doing that is the Vanderburg Soil and Water Conservation District. And they are doing a bounty program for calorie pear. Cut one down and you get a free tree to replace it. We're not doing that in Monroe County. We are working on a bounty program for another species, Asian bush honeysuckle. So stay tuned for that. We're hoping that we'll have some grant money where we could purchase replacement shrubs, that if you take out Asian bush honeysuckle in your yard, you get a free shrub. So that'll be through mc-iris.org. Keep your eyes open for news of that. Good question. Okay. Now, that was my running through the invasive species. I certainly haven't covered everyone. If at the end there's a particular invasive species you want to talk about, I would be happy to do so. For now, I want to shift into so how do you kill these things? And the first thing I want to do before getting into the specifics is ask you to keep 4 rules in mind. You want to be successful when you start controlling invasive plants. And to be successful, you need to do some thinking up front and planning. The first thing is to know what you have. And that means making sure that you've identified it correctly. You can always go to your extension agent, Soil and Water Conservation District, Natural Resource Conservation Service to ask for help in identification. You can go to the MC-IRIS Facebook group and post a picture of what you've got and get it ID'd. Once you've got it identified correctly, figure out how much you've got. Go through your entire property so you know the extent of what it is that you're going to be controlling. The reason is I'm going to give you a number of different ways to kill plants, and some are more labor intensive and some are less labor intensive. And you're going to have to choose the method that works for the amount of invasive you have, that you know you can do this. So know what you have. Map it is a good way to just put it down on paper or even in your head. Here's where most of it is. There's some scattered plants over here, so that you have a handle on the whole job. The second thing is to know what you're managing for. Because again, I'm going to give you different methods. And each method has advantages and it has disadvantages. With some methods, you could inadvertently harm the very thing that you're trying to protect. Like, what if you have beautiful Virginia bluebells all along the creek that runs through your property? And what you want to do is get rid of the privet that has come in and invaded and is shading out your bluebells. You need to pick a method that will kill the privet and not harm the Virginia bluebell. And so remember what it is that you're managing for. So when you finish this job, you know you've got what it is you were trying to protect and you're happy with the results of your control. You need to find a balance between the control of the invasive plants and protecting and restoring good vegetation. Again, there's different types of control. And some of the control methods may end up removing lots of the good vegetation while you're trying to kill the invasive plant, and you end up with bare ground, nothing growing on it. That is an invitation for more invasives. To the extent possible, you want to keep as much native cover as you can, because that will keep invasives from coming back in. And in some cases, if you have no native plants, you may have to restore the area with native vegetation to better armor it against invasion. We'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. And importantly, let's be honest, persistence is key in all methods. None of the methods I'm going to talk to you about are 100% that the invasive plant will be gone. And certainly, it's no guarantee that the invasive plant won't be back. Because we have invasives around us that perhaps people are not controlling, we've got the seed source available for birds who are likely to eat that and bring it back to your land. Invasive control is ongoing, and maintenance is needed even once you've managed to control all of the plants that are currently on your land. So like I said at the beginning, we divide our control options up by the methods that we use against herbaceous plants and those we use against woody plants. So I'm going to go through each of these now with you.
We have another question. If you want
herbaceous
to.
Plants, yeah. Good.
A
Good
question from Nancy. If you want to, I can read it out loud. I have heard that burning bush is an invasive shrub. Is that true? I see it being sold in the large box stores.
Great question. Yes, burning bush is invasive. It is still legal in Indiana. Some of you may be aware that on April 18th, we have a terrestrial invasive plant rule in Indiana that takes effect and will ban the sale of 44 invasive plants. It will ban the sale of purple winter creeper, of Asian bush honeysuckle, of Japanese barberry, and several others, but it will not ban the sale of burning bush, because at the time that this rule was created, which was actually about 5 years ago, it's been a long process, burning bush did not rank as highly invasive in Indiana. We have a group who assesses these plants. So burning bush did not make the cut as highly invasive, and so was not added to the list of banned plants. So it is still legal. However, I will say that we have been updating the assessments of some of the species that we've done in the past. We updated burning bush this last year, and it did rank as highly invasive, because any more reports of burning bush invading our forests, and we were able to use those reports to reassess it, and the score was much higher than it was before. So our hope is that the next time the rule is amended, we will be able to ban burning bush, but that's at least a few years out at this point. Good question. Okay, so herbaceous plants, because they die back to the ground, we can use smothering methods. And I'm going to talk about two smothering methods, mulching and soil solarization. Mulching, what you do is you take big pieces of cardboard, you put them flat on the ground, it has to be flat on the ground, and you put 6 to 12 inches of mulch over the cardboard. Now that stays there, and over the process of months, or even a couple of growing seasons, it will slowly kill everything that is below the cardboard. It can then, after a few years, the cardboard will start to decompose. The mulch will be starting to compost, essentially, to degrade, and you'll end up with new soil, essentially, over the cardboard that you can dig into and plant whatever it is that you want to plant to replace the invasives that were below the cardboard. So in this case, you actually leave the cardboard in place and just plant into it. As you can imagine, in a floodplain, this is not a great option because when the floods come, when the rain and the high water comes, it'll simply wash the mulch away. Also true on a steep slope. If you're on a steep slope, the rainwater will wash the mulch off the cardboard. And of course, it's not a selective method. So if you've got an area of invasives, but you've got some good plants scattered in between them, everything under the cardboard will die in time. So you will want to rescue any good plants you've got and put them somewhere else. You can contrast that with soil solarization, where instead of using cardboard and mulch, you simply put plastic flat on the ground. And again, it has to be flat on the ground. You need to have good contact throughout. So if you've got rocks, if you've got stumps, particularly if they have sharp edges, the plastic will simply over time poke through those and leave holes for water to come through and for light to come through. And that will not help you in your goal to kill everything under the plastic. You have to leave it in place for months, usually at least one season. You'll know when it's finished when you pull up the edge of it and there is nothing green under there at all. If there's even any green, it can come back once you remove the plastic. And that is the next step. Once everything is dead, you need to roll up that plastic and take it up. And you will simply plant into where all the dead invasives were. That does mean that muddy piece of plastic that now you have to get rid of. And like the mulching, this is not selective either. Everything under that plastic will die. So those are two options. The third one on this page is the manual removal, one way or another, of herbaceous plants. And that can be pulling, or it can be mowing, or it can be weed whacking. Now the pulling generally works really well on annuals like Japanese stiltgrass and biennials like garlic mustard, but not very well on perennials. And that's because annuals and biennials have very small root systems, and it makes it very easy to just grab them at the soil surface, pull, and they pop right out. Perennials, that's not the case because they have more extensive roots. If you try to pull them at the ground surface, they simply won't come off your hand. The mowing and weed whacking, you can use.
Can you repeat that last sentence?
Sure.
Before
So pulling is usually used just on annuals and biennials, generally not on perennials. But you can use mowing on perennials. And you can actually use it on annuals and biennials as well. Cutting the plants as close to the soil surface as you can. And if it's an annual or a biennial, doing the mowing before they set seed, because once an annual or biennial has set seed, you've lost for the year. You might as well walk away at that point. The goal is to keep them from putting out more seed, which is the only way they can survive into the next year. The mowing can be difficult to do if you're on rough ground, steep slopes. Cases you are usually using a weed whacker. That can be rather labor intensive, going across slopes and trying to weed whack around stumps and rocks and so on. And that can result in a lot of ground disturbance because you're doing it as close to the soil surface as you can. For some species, if you've got a situation where you have an invasive plant and it's in a field that is accessible by a mower, if you can mow multiple times per year for multiple years, you can often reduce that population down to very little. And when I say often, I mean you would want to mow at least 3 times each year, probably May, July or August, and then September right before winter. And you'd want to do that for at least 3 years. And at that point, you would see the population would be a lot less than it was. Even potentially, you can get rid of it this way. But if you don't have the ability to simply bring a tractor and bush hog it or use a mower, if you're doing this by hand, that is a lot of work to do. So it may not be feasible. Depends on the setting. And the other method for controlling herbaceous plants is chemical. And most often, foliar spray is the application method used against herbaceous species. Sometimes the cut and paste treatment is used if the stem is large enough. Those are 2 of 3 application methods I'm going to be talking about in a minute, just to let you know that those are the applications used against herbaceous plants. But I'm going to talk about them in detail when we talk about the chemical control of woody species. And the last note on this slide is just a reminder, since I'm using the word chemical sort of loosely here, but what I mean by chemical is a labeled herbicide. If it is not a labeled herbicide, I really recommend against using homemade poisons where, and I see these recipes on Facebook a lot, and it's basically open up the drawers, the cupboard doors under the sink and take every toxic product under there, mix them together, put it on the plants and kill them that way, in the misguided idea that that is somehow more environmentally sensitive than using the labeled herbicide. And it's really not. So I suggest strongly that you stick with labeled herbicides when you're wanting to kill plants with a chemical. All right, now we're talking woody species. And the big difference with species is that woody species have live tissue above ground that stays above ground. And so you've got something that you can essentially grab and pull out of the ground any time of year. A weed wrench is a mechanical tool that, as you see in this picture, has a clamp to grab the base of the stem, and then it has a long handle here. And as you can see in this sequence, as you pull back on the handle, the clamp grabs the stem base, and as you continue to pull, it rips the roots out of the ground. This works really well with species like Asian bush honeysuckle, which has very shallow roots, so they can just about pop out of the ground easily. And it works really well when there's soft soil after rain. It doesn't work nearly as well like in August when the ground is really, really dry, especially in our clay soils. It can be very difficult to pull a shrub out at that time of year. And it also doesn't work very well with some of the other bush species that have very deep roots. This really only works with those that have shallow roots. Even Callery pear, I've tried this on Callery pears, and even like a 3-foot tall, tiny little Callery pear, I cannot get to come out of the ground using this method because the roots are so deep, even at that age. It is a labor-intensive method, and it can result in a lot of soil disturbance because when those roots come up, it leaves a big hole, depending on the size of the shrub, of course, but it can mean that you've got a lot of disturbed soil, which can then invite other invasives to come in. In the lower right is the which is another model of a weed wrench. And I want to mention that we now have weed wrenches for loan in Monroe County. We have 8 different toolkits that are located all over the county, and they include a puller bear, which is another make of a weed wrench, and a bucket of tools that you can use, from a soil knife to pruners, loppers, blazing saw, and so on. And that is available through our website, mc-iris.org. You'll see a page there under the resources tab. The first link is toolkits. And I'll show you a map of where the 8 kits are in the county and how to sign up for one and borrow it.
Ellen, there was a question about our kits.
Yes.
In regards to COVID-19, what are the steps that we're taking to make sure that people are safe?
Good question. So the extension office is at this point, but I've heard from them that if somebody really wants their kit, they can make arrangements. They'll be watching their email. They can make arrangements to find a place to have it pick up. But 6 of the 8 toolkits are at private residences. So we're available if some of the other kits are not available, if they're already checked out. The last I looked, 5 of the 8 kits were checked out, but they're only out for 2 weeks and then they're back. So you can sign up to get it next from whatever location is most convenient to you. When we get the toolkits back, we then wipe them all down, all of the handles and tools, with disinfectant wipes so that it's clean and ready for someone else to take next. And if whoever the borrower is concerned, I would also recommend that they bring their own disinfectant wipes, and before they take it home, they can wipe it down themselves. Feel it is, but for some people, I know I loaned my kid out to a teacher who lives near me because he said, I am not working, I need something to do. And so he thought that pulling up Asian bush honeysuckle in his yard would be great. And the last I heard, he had pulled up 400 of them in his yard.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So if you've got some free time now, you might want to borrow one of these and take out frustrations of COVID-19 on your invasives. Okay. And that brings us to the chemical methods. So first, application methods, how you apply chemicals to the plant. And I'm only going to talk about 3 methods: foliar spray, cut and paint, and basal bark. And I'll go through the details on each of those. Before we talk application though, let's talk about the names of the chemicals that I'm mostly going to talk about. Glyphosate is the first one and triclopyr is the second. These are, by and large, the most commonly used herbicides for invasive plant control. Glyphosate, of course, is also widely used in farming and is the most used herbicide worldwide. It has been sold as Roundup, Glystar Pro, Razor. Glyphosate may not be used on or near water unless it is in a formulation that is water approved. And the last 2 brand names, Rodeo and Aquaneat, are aquatic approved versions of glyphosate. Glyphosate is broad spectrum, which means that it kills any plant that is treated. And it is used for foliar application, spraying leaves, and stem treatments. Triclopyr has 2 formulations. One's called amine and one is ester. And amine is sold as triclopyr. The ester version is sold as Garlon 4, Pathfinder 2, Triclopyr 4, Brush Tox. Now this is broadleaf specific, not broad spectrum. Broadleaf specific means that it kills only broadleaves. It won't kill grasses or sedges. So if theoretically you had a lawn that had lots and lots of dandelions in it and you sprayed it with triclopyr, the dandelions would die and the grass would not be harmed. Triclopyr can be used for foliar treatments, for the stem treatments, and it can also be used for the basal bark treatments, which is an oil-based treatment. And the ester formulation is oil soluble. So that's why it's virtually the only thing that's used for the basal bark application method. Every herbicide that you buy has a label, and the label is this outer part here that usually then opens up. It'll have many pages inside that give you all kinds of information about that herbicide and how to use it safely and effectively. And the point is that it is the law that you must follow the label directions and do what the label says. So let's look at a label, just the outer label, real quick to show you what you should be looking for. The first thing you want to look at is the active ingredient. And on this label here, you see it says glyphosate and what percentage it has. Here it says 41%. You need to know that because the 3 different application methods have different solutions, and it is best to start with the concentrated version of the herbicide so that you can then dilute it to the right dilution factor for the particular application you're going to do. In the case of glyphosate, 41% is considered full strength. And so you know that you're dealing with the full strength here, and you can dilute it based on that for which application you're doing. Inside this label, it will also tell you where you may or may not use the product. Remember I said that you cannot use glyphosate products on or near water unless they're formulated for that. The label inside will tell you, are you allowed to use this on or near water or not? And that's an important thing to find out before you start spraying. It will, as I mentioned, tell you how to dilute it for each application. It will tell you the protective equipment that you need to wear to keep yourself safe. In general, you always want to have long pants, long sleeves, nitrile gloves or rubber gloves on your hands, closed-toed boots to avoid as much as possible any exposure of your skin. So that's the label. Make sure that you read the whole thing before you get started, and you'll have all the information you need. Okay, so the 3 applications. Let's start with foliar applications. This is spraying the leaves of a plant to kill it. This is only used when the target species is less than 6 to 7 feet tall. Because if it's taller than that, it means that you are spraying this herbicide up, and that means that some of it may have the chance to hit you as it comes down. That's a bad thing. So this is really for shorter species. This method does have the highest potential for worker exposure and non-target damage. And that's because you are spraying a wide fan of herbicide, and those droplets can go, and instead of just hitting the leaf, they may hit the nearby soil, they may hit nearby plants, they may hit the applicator, you. So this is a method that requires great care be taken so as to not have the herbicide go where you don't want it to go and only hit the target plants. People use backpack sprayers like shown in these pictures that usually hold 3 gallons of mixed product. Or if you're only doing a little, you'll use a small spray bottle. This only works on green leaves. So you have to have green leaves, and that means it's usually only done between, well, May, June, and October, when in our area, plants have their leaves out. The exception, of course, is for evergreen species like winter creeper, where right now, winter creeper is green. You could spray it, and if the day is warm enough, usually a minimum of 50 degrees, you can kill the winter creeper with having very little non-target damage because other native species are not present. You know, that said, clearly the spring ephemerals are now jumping out of the ground, so we're on the cusp of, you know, where our plants are dormant, and this time of year you can harm native plants with spraying out in the woods. Foliar applications require the addition of something called a surfactant to the solution, and that is basically a soap-like solution, and it increases the effectiveness of the product. If you've ever just put water on a leaf, often that water just rolls right off the leaf. It doesn't stick to the leaf. Adding a soap makes that mix stick to the leaf and gives the herbicide a chance to move into the leaf. Some of the herbicides out there will tell you have surfactant already built in. Some do not have it built in. The product we just looked at tells you right in the title, it has surfactant. Sometimes you have to look a little deeper on the label to find out if the surfactant is already built in. If it's not, you need to buy that separately and add it. This is a high volume application at a low concentration. Usually you are told to dilute the product you're using from 1 to 5% by volume. And what that means is that if you want a 1% solution and you want to add to 1 gallon, 1% of that is 1.28 ounces of herbicide, the rest of water, and you've got your gallon of 1% mix. And so it's high volume, a lot of fluid, but it's a very, very dilute fluid. Cut and paint application. Advantages to cut and paint application is that there's minimal non-target damage and worker exposure, because all you're doing is first cutting down your tree or shrub and then painting just the stump with the herbicide. So very little herbicide is used, and it's very targeted with very little chance of it having non-target impacts off that stump. You can apply it to any size tree, any size shrub, but that's also the thing you don't generally use it on is herbaceous plants, because they don't have a woody stem. You can do it just about any time of year, except for right now. Now is not the greatest time of year to do cut stump. Often you will see water being expressed out of the stump, because all of the water and nutrients are flowing from the roots below ground up to the shoots to help with the bud break and leafing out of the plant. And if that is happening, water is expressing out, all that's going to happen if you put herbicide on it is it's going to get washed off, and it's not going to be effective. So usually you avoid the spring with cut and paint. Late winter, summertime are great times to do this application. Once you cut it, you want to apply the herbicide as soon as possible, certainly within a half hour. And you're applying it to the cambial layer, which is just inside the bark. It's the living part of the tree. The inside here, you apply herbicide to that, it's not going to do anything. As they're showing here, they're applying herbicide to this outer cambial layer right there. That's what's going to translocate the herbicide down to the roots and kill the plant. In terms of stump height, somewhere between 2 and 6 inches is best, and as flat as you can make it. The flatter, the better, because that will keep the herbicide on the stump, not allow it to roll off. If it's over 6 inches, the taller that stump is, the harder it is for the herbicide to make it all the way down to the roots, because it's a long distance to go. And you want the stumps generally high enough that you can find them again in order to put the herbicide on them. It is very easy for these stumps to disappear in the leaf litter once they're cut. Either back sprayer if you're doing a very big job, or you can use a spray bottle as in this picture, or a small squeeze bottle that has a sponge top, which even decreases the non-target damage, because you just dab the sponge on the stem like this, and there's no way for the herbicide to go elsewhere. This application method is low volume, but it's a high concentration. So usually they were recommending 20 to 100% dilution for cut and paint application on an herbicide label. And say you said, okay, I'm going to do a 50% solution because that's what the label says. If you wanted to make 1 gallon, that means you're taking 64 ounces of herbicide, 64 ounces of water to make up the total gallon. So it's a small amount that you use, but you're in high concentration. So this, you really want to make sure you do not have any skin exposed in this application method. You don't for any of them, but there's a big difference between an herbicide that is herbicide mix that's 1% herbicide versus this one that is 50% herbicide, much more concentrated. And finally, the basal bark application. This is a little different, and some of you are going to find have no interest in this method, but I mention it because it's very helpful for a couple species in particular. This method, you use a backpack sprayer or other sprayer, and you have a triclopyr ester herbicide in an oil carrier, not water as the carrier, oil. And this is sold as, this could be Garland 4 or Brush Tox, and you add it with an oil carrier, one called Axit is possible. Pathfinder 2 is a version where they already have mixed the Garland 4 with the oil for you, so it's ready to use. The big thing is there's no cutting involved. That's the chief advantage of this. This man is just going to spray down this trunk with the oil-based herbicide and walk away. The oil allows the herbicide to penetrate into the cambial layer, be translocated down to the roots, and kill the whole plant without any cutting involved. Makes it much easier as a one-person job because there's no having to cut and then paint and then cut, you know, so it's pretty handy this way. There's more of a chance for non-target damage because as you wet this tree trunk, you're going to have probably some of the oil dripping down and forming a ring around the tree, and that will likely kill plants that are in the immediate vicinity of that tree base. Winter is the easiest time for treatment because you're able to see the stems very well and move through the woods easily. But you can do this literally all year long. The amount that you need to put down is essentially twice the diameter. To say this is a 4-inch diameter stem, that means that you have 8 inches of the bottom of the stem wetted with this oil-based herbicide. If it was 6 inches, it would be 12 inches that you would want to wet, and so on. The reason that we bring it up is because for some species, this is the best option, and Tree of Heaven is one of those species. Tree of Heaven has an incredibly strong sprouting response. So if you cut a Tree of Heaven down, even if you successfully apply the herbicide to that cut stump, you may still have a problem with sprouts coming from the tree. A tree can send out, you know, a dozen different sprouts at different distances around that tree. And now you have all of those plants to deal with. They are much less likely to do that if you use the basal bark application method. By spraying on the bark and letting that kill the tree, you don't seem to get that sprouting response. The other reason that this is a nice method for Tree of Heaven is that Tree of Heaven has cardiotoxins in its sap. And cardiotoxins, basically, if you get enough of the cardiotoxin on your skin, it can mimic heart attack symptoms, cause you heart problems. There are people who have had that happen to them. It's been written up in the, I think, Journal of New England Medicine. As I recall, there was somebody who worked for Bloomington Parks and Rec who ended up going to the emergency room with heart attack symptoms. So this method allows you to kill the tree without getting any sap on you. In general, avoid getting the sap of any plant on you because they have a surprising number of secondary compounds that can cause you problems, whether it's rashes or itching or so on, but this is just a particularly bad one. This application method has a medium volume, uses a medium volume of mix, and it's at a medium concentration. The concentration usually recommended is 20% herbicide, and a 20% solution would look like this if you wanted a gallon. 25.6 ounces herbicide with 102.4 ounces of oil. Mix that together and you've got 1 gallon to use. So it's medium amount, medium concentration. Okay, now about a couple hours ago at this point, I sent you a calendar of control, and this is where we're going to talk about that. So if you have it handy, you might want to bring it out, look at it, because what I've given you, all this information, and you'll have these slides again, that is all the information you need to read this calendar of control and understand the specific method to use for any species that you're dealing with. So for instance, look at the front page of the invasive species calendar of control. It starts out with some information on how to read the calendar, exhorting you to use pesticides wisely. And then it gets into the species, and it says shrubs. And it lists 6 invasive shrubs: autumn olive, Asian bush honeysuckle, Japanese barberry, multiflora rose, privet, winged burning bush. And it tells you the general treatment. All 6 shrubs, essentially, you use the same herbicide, the same timing, the same application methods are usable. And so for all 6, if you go to the right then and look at the calendar, you can see there are 3 methods. Orange is foliar spray. Look at that one first. It says May to September, you can kill any of those 6 shrubs with a foliar spray. Now, go to the bottom of the page and look for that orange box. And what it's telling you is that the foliar spray should be 3% glyphosate and 0.5% non-ionic surfactant. A non-ionic surfactant is just the common type of surfactant you would use in applications like this. And so we've already talked about those chemicals, surfactants, and how to calculate your percentages. However, there's also the purple method, is cut surface treatment. And you see that has a much wider window on the calendar. As we talked about, it's not great in the spring, so April and May, they're suggesting don't use it. But the rest of the year, you can do cut surface. And if you go down to the bottom of the page, you'll see it says cut surface treatment with 50% glyphosate, 50% water. And the third method in blue is the basal bark treatment. Now they note this can be very difficult on multiple stemmed shrubs. And most people would not use basal bark on shrubs for that reason. Because if you imagine an Asian bush honeysuckle and how big those can be and how the base can be made up of like a dozen different big stems, when you paint the stems, you have to paint every stem and all the way around. And it can be very difficult to be flexible enough to get the herbicide around all the bases of the honeysuckle shrubs. So
Ellen, I just want to hold for a second. I got knocked off. I wanted to make sure that no one else did.
No. Let's see, let me look at participant box. It's looking like
we're all still there, it looks like. So
it looks like it. Oh, I'm sorry
okay.
You got knocked off.
No, it's okay. If anyone has any questions or if they missed anything, type it in the messages.
Excellent. Okay. So basal bark is not usually used on shrubs. It's usually used on trees because that's a single stem and much easier to be able to coat that thoroughly. You can go down to vines then, and you'll see they're divided. First, the evergreen vines, and then second, the deciduous, because there are different methods that can be used for evergreen vines than deciduous. And you'll see that for periwinkle, English ivy, winter creeper, those 3, if you follow the calendar, there's a red box, and it talks about the timing there. If you go to the red box at the bottom, this is using foliar spray with 3% tricloperamine and 0.5% surfactant due to waxy leaves. These species do not respond well to glyphosate, which is why there's a different recommendation. Because of those waxy leaves, the tricloperamine is suggested. And if you go through the rest of the species on the front and now flip it over, and you'll see the back has the forbs, the grasses, the trees. You'll see there are different methods. In a couple of cases, there are different chemicals that are being suggested because they've been found to be more effective than glyphosate or tricloper. But all of that information is laid out for you. We've added a couple things at the bottom of the back page I wanted to point out that may be helpful to you. Under commonly sold herbicide brand names, and it says full strength % active ingredient in parentheses. What that means is when you look at the different chemicals we list, let's look at the left side first, which is the non-selective herbicides. They impact all plant species. You'll see glyphosate is listed and it says 41 to 54% in the parentheses. That means that you will find glyphosate at 41 to 54%, and that is the full strength. So everywhere on this sheet, when we say you should do a 3% triclopher or a 5% this, we're assuming that you're starting from that factor, somewhere between 41 and 54% active ingredient in glyphosate. You'll see we then list a bunch of brand names that you can purchase glyphosate as, and it ends with the ones in blue. Those are the ones that are approved for aquatic situations. The box on the right is the selective herbicides that only impact some species. And you'll see there's the triclopyr ester, triclopyr amine. In each case, it has in the parentheses what the full strength or concentrate percentage is. We've got cethoxidum, which is a grass-specific herbicide. So this is one where it would kill your grass, but not the dandelions, so to speak. And so there's just some of the basic herbicides that you're going to see for sale and information about them. And the bottom box is the commonly sold adjuvants. Adjuvants are additives that increase the effectiveness of herbicides, and surfactants is one example of that. We've already talked about those surfactants. It gives you the name of several different surfactants you could purchase, and a couple that are in blue are the aquatic safe surfactants. And it also lists basil oil, which you would need to mix with the triclopyr ester to do a basil bark application, and dyes. You saw in some of the pictures that the herbicide was blue. That's because it had dye added. I add dye to all the herbicide I mix for two main reasons. It helps me see where I've applied herbicide. So if I've missed a stump, I can go back and catch it and treat it. But it also shows me if I got any on me, if there's a spot on my shirt, if there's some on my boot, and I know that I need to clean that well with soap and water. So that's the calendar of control and all of the details of how to put together everything we just talked about, the application methods, the chemicals, with this sheet to learn the timing and the specific treatments. All right, now I'm gonna have just a few minutes, I'm gonna summarize talking a little bit about what happens when the invasive plants are gone. What we're finding is that where you have invasive plants that are so dense, there aren't any native plants, we need to go in and restore. We need to plant some other kind of plants so that we can armor the site and keep invasives from coming back in. And what we suggest to people is that people grow Indiana natives. Wherever you are, native plants are not invasive. So it means that you're not going to
that first part got interrupted. I apologize.
Thank you. The first reason that we plant natives is they're not invasive, that they will not expand, cause damage to your land, they will not move to your neighbors, and so they're a safer alternative. But they are also so beneficial. They provide important ecosystem services, which are benefits that nature provides to humans. For instance, you can have supporting benefits from native plants because they provide habitat for insects, birds, reptiles, and all animal life. They have regulating functions they provide for us, like reducing the sedimentation into streams, reducing flooding. They have provisioning benefits. Native plants have some usefulness in terms of edibility or medicinals. And they can have cultural benefits in that our native plants provide beautiful and relaxing spaces for recreation. And we like to point out that Grow Indiana Natives is actually a program that is sponsored and hosted by the Indiana Native Plant Society. And what it does is it promotes businesses that sell native plants or design with native plants. And so if you go to Grow Indiana Natives, you'll see a map of all of those businesses, and we encourage you to buy from them. And if you have a favorite native plant seller or designer who isn't part of the program, we would love for you to tell them to join so that we can promote them. And we added just a few years ago another part that if you grow native in your yard, you can certify your native garden. And you can do that again at growindiananatives.org. Last week, we certified a garden. So we encourage you to do that. It's free, and it's a good way just to show your support for native plants. So here's the problem that I need to lay out for you. We have a deer problem. And the issue is that deer eat native plants, but they often avoid invasive plants like garlic mustard. So take a look at this forest scene that I created with clip art. You've got trees, you've got a couple of deer, you've got wildflowers, you've got little shrubs, you've got baby trees, you've got ferns, you got a couple little garlic mustard plants in there too. What happens if we get more deer? What happens is the deer continue to eat all of the native plants that are available. So they can't get the big tree, but they got all the baby trees are gone. All of the wildflowers are gone. All of the shrubs are gone. And you're left with a few ferns and a whole bunch of garlic mustard in that woods. Now, what happens if you keep the deer out? If you fence an area and keep the deer out, within 10 years, diversity that you lost, because garlic mustard cannot be will not outcompete native plants. The only way that garlic mustard can really invade an area is if the area is disturbed in some way, like with deer eating all the plants. The way we look at it is that the invasive plant is, in this case, is just the passenger. It's the deer that are doing the driving. They are causing the damage to the system, and invasive plants are taking advantage of that. And unpalatable invasive species that do this include garlic mustard, Japanese barberry, and Japanese stilt grass. Here's a picture from southeast Monroe County, and everything you're looking at in the understory of this forest is Japanese stilt grass. There was one shrub, I think that was a spicebush shrub, and there's nothing. All of the native wildflowers are gone, even the ferns were gone. No young trees, nothing. And that is because in that part of the county, the deer population is incredibly high, and they have essentially eaten everything edible. They don't eat Japanese stilt grass. So this is what we're seeing in some parts of Monroe County. Do when you are planting prime invasive plants out, you can plant deer-resistant native species. And there is a list of deer-resistant native species on the Bloomington website, City of Bloomington website, which is really quite good. If you want to go to the expense, you can install fencing that is tall enough to keep out deer, or you can try and use repellents that are a temporary measure that keep the leaves from being palatable to deer. You should certainly not feed deer because that simply makes the situation worse. And importantly, you can support appropriate deer management and research. We are still looking to figure out how much of a problem deer are in the county and in different parts of the county to our native plant communities and how big of a factor they are in how invasive species are moving in. So if you want to be part of a citizen science deer browse experiment, we would invite you to apply by April 3rd. If you own more than 1/3 of an acre in Monroe County, and 1/10 of an acre or more of it is unmown woody vegetation, essentially forest, and it's dominated by woody invasive species, like the ones we talked about today, please apply. And we have a little link where you can apply. What will happen then is next month we'll be choosing 20 landowners in the county. We will then come out to your land, remove the invasive woody species from a 4-meter by 4-meter area, not your entire property, sorry, but from an experimental plot that is about 12 feet by 12 feet, and we'll establish an experiment there with your help. it will be planting 72 native plant species, some of them inside deer exclosures and some outside deer exclosures. This is a small exclosure. It's just a 3-foot diameter wire ring that goes in. And then we would follow that for several months in order to see what the impact is of deer on native plants and on the invasive plants that are in the area. So for anyone interested, we highly encourage you to apply. And then we'll be in touch next month with people. So that is everything that I had on for this workshop. And I would be happy to take any questions at this point, whether there was a species I didn't talk about that you wanted to talk about, or specific questions about what I just said. I would be happy to take any questions. I will mention while I wait for any questions, I'm looking at the poll for those of you who took the poll that I had. Boy, the #1 hated invasive plant, Mary, can you guess?
Japanese knotweed?
No, good guess. That was in second place. Multiflora rose was #1. I think it's the thorns. People hate the thorns. And nobody said that they hated garlic mustard.
I sent in the comments a link to the toolkit loan program, if anyone wants to click on that.
Oh, good. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, there is a link on that website that will take you to show you which kits are available and which aren't. If they're not available, I encourage you, if you're interested, still to make contact with the toolkit host. And basically you can reserve it to be the next person to get it once it comes back. All right. Well, hearing no questions, I appreciate everybody being with us this afternoon. I hope that you all stay healthy and safe, and maybe you can take advantage of this time in your yard, practice some of the methods that you just learned. All right. So I will say thanks and goodbye to everyone.
Thank you.